of that bigger conversation, Jenny. It is 8:01 and we should get kicking things off.
You actually keep us to time brilliantly. Good morning,
I,
everybody.
I try.
Welcome. So, yes, for those of you not in Calgary, this is what Calgary looked like at the beginning of the week, more specifically, SAIT. And there's probably a whole lot more than that today on the surface. What you can see there is one of our main buildings on SAIT's campus. And we are located on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot and the people of the Treaty 7, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, the Iyahi Nakoda of Bearspaw, Chiniki, and Goodstoney. We're situated in an area in the Blackfoot tribes, an area that the Blackfoot tribes traditionally call McKintis, where the Bow River meets the Elbow River. We now call it the City of Calgary, which is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta. So hopefully, somehow, somewhere, you can take a moment to recognize our land this morning. And if you are in snowy climes, go safely out there today, tomorrow, and beyond as well. Thanks, Craig.
Perfect. Thank you, Jenny.
Welcome.
And folks, you'll notice that we are joined today by Curtis Braun. It's for a very important conversation that we've had requests for over the last little while. Curtis is one of our amazing facilitators here at SAIT. And Curtis, I think what I'd like to do just to kick things off is just turn things over to you to give a little background on yourself and your connection to neurodiversity, and then we can go from
Perfect.
there.
Yeah, happy to do so. Thank you so much for having me today, Craig and Jenny, and thank you to all the folks joining and your interest in this subject. As Craig mentioned, my name's Curtis Braun. Where do I start? I've been attached to SAIT specifically for about the last 5 years. Prior to, and I'll circle back to that, but prior to that, I spent about 20 years in the private sector, leading a variety of HR organizations through cultural, business, and digital transformations. Which led me to SAIT about, like I said, about 5 years ago, where I was part of the employee services team leading employee or HR innovation. And it led me to joining Craig and joining Jenny and their team from a facilitation perspective. And so I've spent the last couple of years um, facilitating in the corporate development space and the international and some of our continuing ed. And part and parcel to that, I split off from the employee ranks in the HR space and went into consulting world, where I've been had the privilege of supporting a number of organizations through a number of their transformations. Specifically on the subject of neurodiversity, where do I start? I guess usually when you get into the space, it's not necessarily by choice, it's by personal experience. And so my wife and I have the pleasure of being the parents to an 11-year-old neurodivergent son. And through that journey, especially over the last 9 years, we've become very intimate with his space. And so I'm not here to necessarily profess that I'm an expert in all things neurodiversity. This is based on my experiences and our journey with our son. So that's what brought me here today. So thank you for having me.
Well, and thank you for joining us, and thank you for being willing to share your experience and your personal expertise in this area. Because I think Jenny and I were looking forward to this conversation from the standpoint that this is an area that I don't think either one of us espouses to really have any level of expertise or high level of knowledge in per se. So I think we're looking forward to learning as much as everybody else on the call today. And I think maybe where we can take it from here is just kind of, if you can, for folks who are joining may not have as high level of knowledge around it as you do, is what is neurodiversity, and why, from a workplace and a leadership standpoint, why is it important we're having this conversation today?
Absolutely. So maybe in its simplest terms, I guess the easiest way to look at it is it's really about the diversity of the human mind. We all think differently, but there's much more beneath the surface. It's not as just simple as, hey, I have autism or I have ADHD. It's the differences in how people learn. It's the differences in how people perceive things like time, the difference in our sensory, on how sensory impacts our ability to consume information and focus. It's differences in communication, in our ability to pay attention, and arguably in our emotional expression. So when you think about leading teams, leading organizations, all these things play a role in how we work together with one another and how we lead others and how we go through journeys with one another.
Wow. And what a great sort of, I don't know, summary on it. And one of the things, actually, I came across this when I was preparing for this conversation, but it really sort of smacked me in the face a little bit. And it was that piece you said there about emotions, even, because we spend a lot of time, you and I, in the world that we live in, talking emotional intelligence. And the only way that we can relate to emotions is based on how we experience them.
Yes.
And when we enter into the conversation of neurodivergence, as you rightfully said then, it's really, really different. And so immediately off the bat for leaders, we're talking about this is about listening, learning, and developing together. And it's a little bit different perhaps than everything that's ever come before, where we've just totally lived in the world that's created for neurotypical. And now we're aware, so we know more, we have to do better. And I think that's where one of our first chinks is for leaders is how do we do that piece in terms of, okay, now I recognize I have neurodiversity on my team, either because I recognize it or somebody has had the courage and the awareness to talk to me about it. How do I do this kind of thing within there? I know you have some interesting sort of numbers and facts towards, and we were talking the other day, you and I, just virtually about adults who, you're going to have to help me with the language here, but who will or will not share whether they have.
Yeah, disclosure.
There we go. That's the word I was looking for. Thank you.
Yeah, adults' willingness to
Yeah.
disclose if they are neurodivergent, and that's the thing. There may be people on your team that you go, and we've seen this growing up. We're just, something seems to be a little bit different. Our ability to interact just doesn't seem as smooth or as cohesive as it does with other individuals. And there may be neurodivergence at play there, and it's just non-disclosed. I mean, historically, disclosure has been an issue, and masking has been a much more, I don't want to say appropriate approach, but has been a reaction to not wanting to disclose. So people will do their best to mask. But where people are have taken the step forward in disclosing, and I will share, actually, you prompted me, I wanted to share a number because I know even when we got our son's diagnosis and going through that emotional roller coaster, um, we were told right off the bat when we were in a group of parents that we're getting the same message at the same time that 30% of you will likely not accept your child's diagnosis. So even still today, there's a reluctance um, to accept and move forward with a diagnosis just purely from the just purely through the lens of stigma and perception and the
Gosh.
difficulties that can come with that.
Wow. That's a huge number, and it takes me straight to the amount of unlearning that we have to do. I mean, really what we're talking about here, I think, is labeling and everything that was and how stuck people get on that and how detrimental that is to or just well-being as a starting point. But anywhere that non-disclosure can be traumatic on all sides.
It is. And I mean, it's one of the reasons I'm happy I'm here because labeling can be a double-edged sword. It can come with stigma, but labeling can also come with support.
Can we talk about that? Can you double click on that a little bit? Because I think that's great.
Well, I mean, especially, if it happens early in life, right? There's things that you can do or there's interventions that can take place, and it's not to change the individual. And it's not to, I would say, it's not an exercise. I'm going to go back to masking, right? It's not an exercise, and hey, we'll give you the tools to better mask in society, although that does happen to be a very harsh reality because this is a neurotypical developed world. But you're given the tools and resources. We were talking about emotions earlier. So how do we understand zones of regulation and understanding and interpreting emotions and what is appropriate, maybe emotional, I hate to use that, I'll use air quotes, appropriate emotional response or emotional processing. The whole matching of facial language and body language with what people are saying is a great indicator on, are they actually mad in what they're saying, or are they maybe just being a little bit terse or curt to get a point across? Those very slight nuances that we as neurotypical individuals pick up on very easily, those need to be learned and they need to be focused on. And there are resources out there. I mean, our son, if I may, for a minute, our son essentially started school at 2. Um, but it's obviously a different type of schooling. It was very intensive on, how do we teach things like regulation? How do we teach things like communication? How do we work through things like sensory issues? How do we teach things like time perception? All those nuances I shared earlier, and what makes us all unique is really, again, not trying to acclimatize, but rather help understand and appreciate this is the way in which the world works, and how can you navigate that a little bit more effectively.
Yeah.
Curtis, just on masking, the question has popped up in the Q&A here is, if you could please explain what masking means and what the harms of it may be.
Yeah, and masking isn't unique to neurodivergent individuals. Masking is really what's the face, or what's the persona I need to put out there and project out to the world to have them accept me differently, or have me accept me in a certain way. So, you hear this a lot in the business world. I got to fake it until I make it, and that's acting as if. So it's acting as if you know or you understand something so you can feel accepted. Maybe if in the neurodivergent space, it's, hey, I have to go to that social function so people perceive that I actually want to be a part of the team, although it may be very uncomfortable for me to be there, depending on what that circumstance or that scenario is. So it's really going to levels of uncomfortability for other people's uncomfortability is probably the way I prefer to approach it from a neurodivergent perspective.
Okay. So somewhat along this lines, something you said earlier triggered a question for me, when it's kind of come through in the chat as well, around, if you're a leader, recognizing neurodiversity on your team. And I'm struggling with how to word this question properly without sounding, I'm just going to kind of lean into it a little bit, but how do you recognize it versus personality traits? You understand, like some diversity is very easy to recognize.
Yeah.
Neurodiversity may not be. I don't think we're trying to create experts in neurodiversity and being able to, if you're inheriting a team, recognizing somebody on the team is neurodiverse. Is there something in there you can double click on? Because I'm struggling a little bit with trying to figure out how do you, right? How do you recognize it versus labeling somebody incorrectly? And obviously we're not looking to label anybody, but
No. And that's where I was going to go with it, Greg. I don't think we're in the business of diagnosing people or bringing to their attention their complexities, or again, probably what we're perceiving is more our complexities and how we're interacting with them and our uncomfortableness, or and I think it's leaning into that and it's embracing it. And I think it's really going to where they are and acting as if nothing is necessarily, I don't want to, acting as if nothing is really wrong. It's okay to act with inquisition and to be curious, but healthy curiosity. And no matter if you're neurodivergent or not, people want connection, people want communion, people want conversation. And I think it's just approaching it, Craig, in getting to know people at an individual level and doing it authentically, not approaching as if, hey, there's something here I need to figure out. It's, this is somebody I need to get to know. And through having the conversation through that lens and going, hey, and I think that's a great practice for all individuals. Take the time to get to know them on a one-to-one basis, lean into that, and approach a conversation and approach it in such a manner that doesn't come with rules. So if you're leading a virtual team, that's probably where it's even a little bit more complicated, is how can I find some time with you? What's a time that would work well? And setting that stage on, I'd like to get to know you a little bit more. I'm doing this with everyone on the team, and maybe it's setting that stage through a team meeting. And then not having any rules around it or any expectations, but rather just, you know, maybe you can come with a list of questions you may have for me, and let's start the conversation through your lens on if, you know, as your leader, is there anything, you know, I need to know to support you better? Is there anything I need to be aware of on how it relates to how you see yourself engaging and interacting with this team? But not, and back to rules and going, hey, even if it's a virtual conversation, we don't have to have our cameras on. That's a big one, right? You don't have to come into the office to have this conversation. What would be most comfortable for you? And one of the ways I've done that historically with my teams is I will usually send out a questionnaire in advance that would say, hey, for our one-to-one, do you have an ideal meeting place? Do you want to do it online? Are there things that you'd like to talk about? And it allows people to process things in advance and plan and prepare. And again, you're putting the power in their hands to bring forward the conversation that they'd like to have, instead of you trying to maybe force a conversation that you may want to have.
Yeah. I like that. And I, what you just said there, the last bit about one-on-ones and trying to personalize them, I think, frankly, is just good practice for one-on-one with anybody on your team.
That's the
Right?
thing.
Like,
It really is. It
and
really
so,
is. And I know one of the other things, a key question I think is important to really ask people is, what does, through your dialogue with them, is, I'm just curious, and I'm asking everyone on my team, what does belonging mean to you?
Yeah.
that's good. I think that ties in a little bit to a question that we just got here, Curtis. I'm going to throw it out. I met someone that had identified themselves as neurodivergent, a good person, but also very difficult to deal with. It became like all of their needs superseded everyone else's on the team. Whatever irritated them is what we had to accommodate, but that's not productive. And if anything, it's very irritating and unfair to the rest of the team. How do you deal with that?
I mean, my approach would be, I mean, there's still rules of conduct, and there's still team norms, right? And I think
Right.
that's another thing that's really important as a leader is, and when you back to having one-to-ones is, you know, are there you can inquire as to what people think team norms should be before you establish them. Um, and then as you establish them, you share that these were collected both individually, and then have dialogue about them as a collective. And I think if you make everyone a part of that journey in establishing what team norms and how you deal maybe with where there can be disruptions or disagreements, I think as long as people are aware of what the guidelines and the boundaries are, neurodivergent or not, and arguably, and I'm just speaking through my experience, our son is much more about adhering to boundaries than my wife and I are. It's actually a
Mm.
blessing to him if boundaries are there, because he knows then within the parameters, not within the parameters of which he can operate, but he respects them and he understands them, and he really appreciates when he's aware of them. Because that lack of awareness, or where there's inconsistency and blurred lines, is probably more complicated than having them.
Yeah. I think there's so many good nuggets in the conversation that the two of you have just had. And it's intriguing to me because as we talk about this, none of it's difficult. Like, this is just great practice, personalizing your one-on-ones, clear, like really good, I don't know, hygiene around expectations, around clarity, around boundaries, around team norms. And they're conversations often that don't happen. And this actually is a brilliant starting place for us to ensure that we are having those conversations and we are looking at it. I came across a really cool, I hadn't come across the term before, which is an ignorance on my behalf, universal design. And that was a little bit new to me. And universal design is talking about workspaces and work environments. And I think the essence of it was so that they can be accessed and understood. There might have been another part in there, by everybody. Doesn't matter what your size, gender, neurodivergent, like anything. Universal design is literally that, it's universal. And
Yes.
these are universal practices, and opening up that conversation. And we've seen, in fact, the last 5 years, boundaries are missing. We're not having that conversation well enough. So let's start having that conversation. And the problem with boundaries is people find them difficult because they feel like, and I think you mentioned this earlier, because they feel like rules. And there's a part of us that says we don't want to set rules anymore and rules don't work because we need to be flexible. And we need to, so I think we get caught in that tension of there is things that we do need, and there is a huge amount of flexibility that we're going to have to practice here. But where's that guideline? Where's that guardrail that this is okay, this is not okay? Maybe that's sort of part of the big conversation.
It is, and I think keeping in mind that the fact that those rules and those, and it's not that the rules and the boundaries evolve over time, but they do, right? So
Yeah,
as
yeah,
we evolve as a team, your norms may evolve, and what
yes,
was important 5 years ago may not be important now. Like you said,
100%.
there's been a dissolving of some of those boundaries and some of those rules. And I think we, and then there's the whole flip side, which is I think we've seen an evolution of groupthink, which is completely counterproductive to
Yeah,
neurodivergent thinking, because if anything, neurodivergence is going to challenge groupthink, you know,
yeah,
exponentially. And
yeah,
I think that those are two major factors that are at play today is, how do we reestablish boundaries, but then how do we go individualized thoughts and ideas if we truly went out of the box in critical thinking? It's going to
mm,
challenge the status quo, especially where there may be strong elements of groupthink.
yeah.
Yeah.
I want to go way back just for the sake of anybody else who may have missed it, or just to highlight, how important it was. And you talked about virtual meetings, and cameras don't always have to be on.
Yeah.
And this is one of those ones where we seem to be doing this, because it was for a while where I would have promoted and preached, yeah, put your camera on. We need this connection. We need to see each other. And actually, to your point, that can be exhausting for someone who is neurodivergent. And that's another thing we haven't said yet as well. You're not sort of A or B. Everything sits differently for everybody. And I think that's one of the flexibilities that's a little bit hard for leaders is if I say I am this and you say you are that, we're not, or I am this and you're this as well. We're not the same. Like it's different all over the place. And so I really liked what you said there is, what will work for you? And okay, sometimes maybe we do need to have cameras on so we can just see faces and know the face behind the name. But if that, regulating that emotion so that my face matches what I'm trying to say is just exhausting and taking me away from the energy that I need for the thinking in the meeting, that can be a real game changer within a team, because then you get the whole of that person there because they're not trying to concentrate on having the right facial expression or whatever. So I thought that was a really good little sort of tidbit that people could contemplate, especially if you're working hybrid or remote with people.
Yeah. And there may be a balance there, which is,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not suggesting this is the answer, but it's maybe you turn your camera on when you speak. Um,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
because one thing again that we've learned with our son is um, because there's a lot of dialogue out there about eye contact and the importance of eye contact. You see this a lot in the talent space when you're interviewing people, and there's a lot of credibility and value placed on people's ability to maintain comfortable eye contact. But for some people, maintaining eye contact actually distracts away from them listening because they're so focused on paying attention to you and your body language, they're not hearing anything that's coming in.
yeah.
And so I think that's correlates completely over to having your camera on. Have it intentionally on for purpose and to let us know that you're there and you're paying attention when the time is right, but that doesn't mean that it's an all or nothing approach.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
like that.
Well, eye contact here is just about impossible, right? So
It is, right?
it
It
is.
is. So imagine trying to see if we all had our cameras on and you've got 300, 400 people that you're
Yeah,
trying to pay attention to.
yeah.
Yeah.
That just serves
Um, Couple questions have come here. I've got three. Two I'm going to tie together. And I'm not familiar with the acronym RSD. I'm not sure if you are, Curtis, but so I'm going to give you these two questions and we can tie them together because I think they're somewhat related. Is how do you give bad news or criticism to somebody who has RSD, which is often attached to ADHD? So just hold that question. And then as a leader, how do you balance creating a supportive space for neurodivergent individuals while addressing performance issues? Specifically, how do you ensure that you're not accommodating unacceptable behavior or performance problems in a way that might be perceived as discriminatory, while also being sensitive to challenges that may be on the individual's control. So both of these, I think, are somewhat tied to, one is rather specific to RSD and ADHD. I'm not sure if that, if you have knowledge there, but
I think it's rejective sensory disorder. And I
okay.
mean, there's so many, there's a number of
Yes.
disorders that fall under the umbrella of, and I hate to use the word disorders, but it's, you know, there's a lot of complications and challenges under neurodiversity. So it's not just autism, it's not just ADHD. There's a plethora of them. And so I will do my best to speak intelligently at a macro level without being intimate with that, with RSD specifically. So if I was to interpret RSD or as dysphoria, or I just saw it come up on the screen, it's obviously there's going to be a sensitivity there to feedback, right? So feedback is going to be perceived as rejection. And so is there a perfect way to provide feedback? I mean, that's, I think the lesson is there isn't just a one size fits all in how you approach feedback. So if people are willing to disclose what they have, and that's not always the case, I think this goes back to where we started earlier, is as you get to become intimate with people, if you're going to share feedback, share it in a one-to-one fashion. Understand when you're getting to know people, how do you like to receive recognition? How do you like to receive feedback? Because feedback is a part of the business process. It is a part of the leadership process itself. And so when feedback needs to be provided, if you can understand how people prefer to receive it, that doesn't mean that the message is going to land well. But that's feedback, isn't it? And I think feedback is a learning process unto itself. And so that I'm not ever suggesting that neurodiversity is an excuse to not be part of a team as well and be part of what it means to perform on a team. They're not excuses, they are conditions to which and realities to which we just need to adapt, evolve, and learn. And that doesn't excuse either party of learning through the process. So I think if you always approach feedback that it's a learning process, it's not, maybe my feedback might not land well, but I'm learning as well. And I'm hoping you're learning through this process. But there's something that we need to talk about, and there's something that we need to talk about that's not meeting the needs of what we that's not meeting the needs of the established objectives. And I think that then brings about a mature conversation is, are the objectives realistic? And why is the performance an issue? Or is the behavior acceptable? And why isn't that? How does that correlate to our team norms? I think there's always things that you can bring it back to, and you can bring it to a place of neutrality. If you have established objectives, established norms that you can put on the virtual table neutrally, that's what the conversation is about. It's not about you, and it's not about me and our relationship and or agreement or disagreement. It's about these are what we've established as a team, as a norm. This is what we've established as objectives. And this is what we're putting neutrally on the table, and that's what we're having the conversation about. And I think that's a healthy approach for anyone in any capacity. That doesn't mean that things aren't going to go sideways.
No.
That doesn't mean
And
that. And so I hope I answered that question.
No, I think you did, and you know what it says to me is, again, a lot of what we're talking about here is just good practice in general as well, right? The neurodiversity is one aspect of it. If you have to make accommodations, accommodations still don't change the norms, the outcomes, what the team has to achieve, right? It is not about changing that. It is about trying to find a way to have those accommodations help that individual contribute to those objectives of the team,
Yeah. And if
right?
it's the target, I think there's a difference between the target and the path to get to that target, right? And so if
Yeah.
your concern is about the path that people are taking to get there, is that the right thing to focus on? I mean, maybe their accommodations are very real, and sometimes that can take different forms, and maybe that's, hey, maybe that's role adjustment itself altogether. And we could get into monotasking versus multitasking and all of those things, because there are people that that perform very well in much more structured versus much more structured roles versus probably the more common dynamic roles we're seeing in organizations today.
Absolutely. Jenny, anything you want to add on that one before I jump to the other question?
Yes.
Yes.
But
I
it's
knew once feedback came up, Jenny would be all over this.
absolutely. But it's a yes and, because I really liked the conversation that happened there, and I think the yes and is back to that.
Yeah.
How are we reimagining everything that we do? Feedback's one of these great big areas, and I think it's time for us to flick the switch. And the flick the switch means, you know, Curtis, we've covered it, and you did brilliantly. Like, okay, things will go sideways, things will not be up to par. But there's also a big piece in here in where can you catch people doing it right? And are you giving more of that than you are of the where it's going wrong? We're very conditioned to look for what's wrong or what might be a
Yes.
weakness, which is exhausting to neurotypical.
Yeah.
And, you know, this sort of RSD and everything else just adds within there. So that's one part, is for everyone, where are we catching people getting it right? And the other thing that I'm sort of really working with at the moment is, let's go snack size. And so when your feedback is snack size, it becomes literally, it's a bite to chew on. And a bite to chew on is much easier than a great big missive that we've saved up for ages. And now, okay, now I'm going to have that conversation. Well, maybe just have that snack size version. And the third thing that I'll add, sorry, Craig, you asked one,
Okay.
is another thing, and this requires a good conversation, but in that flick the switch, we're always waiting for people to give us feedback. Let's flick it and let's go looking for feedback. So how do we set people up for success? And can we do that within the bounds that we have, is to be able to say, I struggle with this. Can I have some feedback on this? And this is specifically what I'm looking for. There's that snack size piece. And set yourself up for success. This is what I need. And set them up for success. They're only going to give you what you need if you set them up for that. And that's part of a way bigger conversation. I think I've talked Craig into it, that we might have it in January. But I think there's some really good things that we can pull on there that work for everyone, but really help where we have that divergence in our team.
I love that, Jane. I think you need to seek out the struggles too, because
Yes.
people forthcome with struggles. And
Yeah.
is there anything I need to be aware of that you're struggling with? Is there
Love
anything
that.
I need to do differently to help you work through that?
Love that. Yeah.
Yeah. And Jenny, you had me at snacks. So switching gears, question here, and thank you very much for sharing this one. I've masked my ADHD for years and even denied my own diagnosis. I finally come to accept it in the past couple of years, and I'm now getting the help I should have gotten as a child. As a potential leader in the near future, I hope to be open with those I work with. How can I ensure I'm not making anyone uncomfortable, that people still know why I may be acting in a certain way?
The way I would approach that, I guess that question or that response is, I think it's less about sharing the diagnosis. It's about sharing what people might experience. So a good example of that is, hey, you may notice I become easily distracted. You don't need to label why. You can just bring to attention behaviors and or challenges people may experience with you as a leader or as an individual, and being very honest about that. I'm arguably undiagnosed. I don't know if ADHD, maybe ADD, but I'm very honest with my teams that, hey, if we're having a conversation, you may see me close my laptop, or I have to close down my applications, or I have to put my phone in my pocket, because you'll notice I will become distracted by every ding, buzz, or tick that comes across my screen or comes across my device. And so just letting people know, hey, maybe I'm easily distracted. Maybe if there's too much conversation taking place at once, I might have an inability to focus. So as a result, I'm hoping we can, when we have group conversation, that we can try and, and there's great practices out there like, hey, gonna bring a ball into the meeting, and if you hold the ball, you talk. Small little things like that can help you not only manage, but when you do disclose what people may experience, not your actual diagnosis itself, because you can't expect people to understand or interpret what's all beneath the surface there. So if you can help them understand some of those tidbits beneath the surface, that's where the gold and that's where the value is in helping everyone understand and appreciate and work with you as an individual.
I love that. It was excellent.
Yeah, that's great. And I think you kind of covered the follow-up to that, which is what are the benefits and risks of disclosing to your team as a neurodivergent leader?
Yeah. So yeah, double-edged sword. I think
So.
you can have
Yeah.
appreciation and accommodation and acceptance, but I think the downside of that, it's other people's comfort zone that will get in the way, not necessarily yours. And I think that's just always an important thing to remember, even as a leader. Is it my comfort zone that's getting in the way versus the individual that I'm engaging or interacting with? And am I limiting them or putting them in a box um, instead of the opposite, which is I'm going to do my best not to do that, and I'm going to learn through the process instead of making a bunch of preconceived notions or understandings based on my limited experience, right? If I've only watched, I'd say it if you and I could have said this earlier, right? This is the thing in neurodiversity. If you met one person with RSD, you've met one person with RSD. If you've met one person with ADHD, you've met one. If you met one with autism, you've met one. They're not all cut the same. There's even divergence. There's diversity within each of those
Yeah.
diagnoses as well. And I think that's incredibly important to understand and appreciate.
Yeah.
I think there's another thing in there too, Craig, that we should just tap on quickly, and that's for leaders. Curtis, you mentioned often the problem is with our own comfort zone, like
Yeah.
that's the awkwardness. But as a leader, to sort of pay attention, because I think we said at the beginning, we are sort of listening, learning, growing together. People on your team might have trouble with their own comfort zones and what they've experienced or not, for that
Yeah.
sake. And so as a leader, that empathy and that space for where they're struggling, if that's an appropriate word, and
Mhm.
helping them to open up with, let's avoid those boxes where we can. How, as a leader, do you give people that space to talk about that? And I think that's a worthy space to create.
Yeah, can I share a story on this?
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah. Because I think it's a combination of um, things because you still want to create the conditions to stretch people as well.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that's a limiting factor is we go, wait a minute, that doesn't mean we're not capable of growth. So
Yeah.
let me just share, if I may share a story about my son that I think hits the mark on I find it's a fascinating story. Hopefully you do as well. So our son's part of Rocky Mountain Adaptive, and that's a outdoor exploration group out of Canmore. So they do downhill skiing, hiking, kayaking. So he's been downhill skiing at Sunshine since he was about 4 years old. And if you ever met him, you would never in a million years have guessed that he would be a good downhill skier. But the pathway to which we uncovered that um, and the ability to which he performs today has been an interesting journey. What I mean by that is, so you're with ski instructors and they're ski professionals, and they have some great training in the disability space, be it physical or neuro. And so every year, or so for a few years in a row, every year we had a new instructor, and it was the same every year, going, hey, we don't know your son. We need to get to know him. And until we're comfortable with knowing him and his abilities, that's where we'll make a determination on where we'll take him on the mountain. Um, and it was a very interesting challenge for us from the perspective that sometimes if you give people a crutch, they'll take that crutch. And our son is a great example of that. Meaning, if you take him, I'll give you a few. Sorry if this takes a few minutes, but when he started skiing, every year they put tethers on his skis, and so tethers helps the instructor behind steer him. And even by the third year, they were still putting tethers on him. And he was like, okay, you're going to steer me. I'm just going to let you steer me wherever the heck you want to take me. I'm not going to show you my skills because I don't have to. I'm going to kind of sit back and enjoy the ride and you can steer me. And he was having a wonderful time. And if they ever dared to take those tethers off, they would make sure it was on a green run and he would scream down the hill like a banshee and just straight down full speed, no turns. And then we get this sense of panic going, hey, we have to put the tethers on. Well, the reality of the situation was he knew he could go down a green run without turning under control, so he didn't have to turn. That wasn't what, so we weren't teaching him the right skills. So as his parent, I decided, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take him up to the top of the mountain, as a wise, as a wise dad, I guess, right? And so I took him to the top of the mountain, and I took him down a blue run, and then I took him down a black run, and he skied down and he showed us his skills. And it's because, and so I had to video that and I had to show that to the instructor to say, look, if you create the conditions for him to challenge and show his skills, he will amaze you. If you underestimate and put tethers on him, you're only going to get as good as the conditions that you've given him. And so I think, you know, that wasn't our son's comfort zone getting in the way. That was their comfort zone.
Yeah.
And so if you could create the conditions, because people can still be stretched, even if they have a diagnosis, they're not just capable of what they know today. Everyone can be stretched. Everyone can evolve to the next level. And it's about getting out of our comfort zone and creating the conditions to be surprised.
Wow.
Brilliant.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm going to come back to what I've said before too, from the leadership perspective. Isn't that what we should be trying to do for everybody on our team?
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
We've reached that point though. There was one question I had indicated that we would answer live, but I think we'll do it in the follow-up. And that frankly is one that we didn't get to here is the positives or that neurodiverse folks bring to the table, right? It's not all about accommodations, but I think we'll try and get that in the follow-up. And given the number of questions that we have sitting unanswered, Curtis, we may revisit this again in the new year if you'd be so kind as to join
Absolutely.
us.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we've hit that point where it's time to close things up with our big idea, or in this case, Curtis's big idea.
And let's just get there. I'm just going to start the beginning, Curtis, and I'll try and stay with you as you move through, okay?
Sure, and I'll try and move away in a very fluid fashion because I know I probably included more slides than I should have. But okay, yes, this
Okay.
one around expectations, and I think this just builds off of that example I was giving. You're going to see that factor into some of the upcoming slides. That's why I want to share the story in advance. But it's really about the importance of mindset. There is an expectation, or sorry, I shouldn't use that word because it's on the screen. There is a tendency for us when people do disclose, especially that we go, okay, I'm going to adjust my expectations and I'm going to adjust my expectations down. And this slide is actually tongue in cheek because the reality is we need to adjust our expectations down just in the just like the example I gave with my son. If we adjust, if we keep our expectations to where they need to be, I think we should be prepared to be surprised. We should never adjust our expectations down because the reality is that people that are neurodivergent aren't going to perform poorer or perform less. Again, if you create the conditions, I think you will always see people actually exceed the expectations you give them. So if you know somebody is neurodivergent, don't adjust your expectations down because if you adjust your expectations down, the reality of what you experience is going to go down as well. So I would challenge you to take the mindset of we're all capable of more than we know we're capable of. And if we can create those conditions, prepare to be surprised. One big idea. So this is an interesting one through the lens of DEI because, and this isn't a slight against DEI by any means, but we have a tendency to look at it as, hey, let's let's bring everyone into this big box. Let's say everyone's welcome. Let's bring everyone in. Let's celebrate. And I'm not suggesting that that's wrong, but if you think about neurodivergence, it's not about, hey, come in and think like us, come in and understand and appreciate the way that we do things. In fact, I like to look at it as a bunch of different doors and going to others and walking through their door, meeting them where they're at, understanding that them as a unique individual because some of the things that they're going to think about are going to be contrary to what you think. And so they may not want to be in the box. They might not agree with what's in that big inclusive box, right? This goes back to the whole concept of groupthink I was talking about earlier. Some of the most disruptive thought patterns out there today are arguably from neurodivergent people. You just might not know that they're neurodivergent. So this is my one big idea. It's not just about DEI is not just about inviting people in as much as I think it is going to where other people's are and meeting and where other people are and meeting them where they're at and understanding.
Perfect.
This is why I shared the story earlier, and I used the ski analogy. So I wasn't sure if I'd have enough time in this forum to share that story, but really, how is your comfort zone getting in the way? Are you only helping give people the easiest path? And as a result, are you seeing are you helping them see what they're ultimately capable of? And where because we all want to see growth, regardless of who we are, we all want to see growth. We all want to do better. We all want to make a difference. And so are we, what's the path we're setting up for people? Are we challenging them, right? And there's a flip side to this slide as well, which is you don't need to be an expert in this space as a leader, to operate well with neurodivergent people. It's not about being an expert in autism or an expert in ADHD. It's about, again, I think getting out of your comfort zone and really talking about a lot of the practices that that I was sharing, but Jenny was topping up with her expertise, and that is applying things that we should be doing universally with everyone. You don't need to be an expert in actual diagnosis to make a difference in somebody's life who's neurodivergent. This is a picture of our son as well, and then I'll share a little bit of a story here, because this is more about, and I shared this earlier, it's about if you can set the target and create the space for people to get there, not the conditions by need to get there, I think then you're going to be welcoming to the path that people take. So really quickly, if I may, sorry, these are both those arrows are supposed to point toward the target. So what the image you see on the left, The Good Dinosaur, that was one of our son's favorite first movies that he liked. But when he started spelling, he spelt right to left. And that's because he wasn't familiar yet with how spelling occurred. So he read before he spoke. And when he started writing, he would always write right to left. And was that wrong in the grand scheme of things? Did he still achieve the target of writing the word? Absolutely not. So there isn't always a singular straight path, and I know we all know this from A to Z, right? It can dip, it can dive, it can weave. As long as leaders, we can set the target, we can create the space for people, and if we do that, I think we'll be very welcoming to the path to get there. This is another big one in the neurodivergent space, and that is I think there's usually a belief out there that routine and change are at odds. And that structure has to be there for neurodivergent individuals for them to succeed. And what we've learned, I'll share one other quick story. We sold our home a few years back in the midst of the pandemic, and we for very good reasons. So having a neurodivergent son who ended up being kind of a prisoner of his own home, and he couldn't read people's facial expressions with with masks and whatnot. He was actually starting to regress in his development because we couldn't take him out, we couldn't socialize him, we couldn't take him to the pool, we couldn't take him to the library, we couldn't take him to a playground, and he had a hard time interacting with strangers whose faces he couldn't see. So we made an interesting choice, and that was we decided to go on a 1.5 year road trip to bring him to experiences where we know that he could experience a different reality of getting out into the community, because he had social communication challenges. And a lot of people would go, wow, as the parent of a neurodivergent child, you've completely disrupted his routine. He was homeschooled, he learned in the same room, in the same house from his mom, and with a lot of the same, routine was a big thing for us, and routine was a big thing for him. And the only reason I share the fact that we did that is we were moving around a lot. We were renting different homes. We were staying in different hotels. We were in different cities. We were taking him to different places that he'd never been, different swimming pools, different libraries. And what we learned was routine and change were not at odds. In fact, if you make change part of the routine, you will see, we saw exponential growth. So now he actually welcomes change. And so he wants change to be a part of the routine. He doesn't want to go to the same restaurants. He doesn't want to watch the same things. He doesn't want to have the same experiences, which is counter to what we were led to believe, even from many professionals as we were going through our journey with his diagnosis. So I would say if you can make change part of the routine, it's actually a recipe for success versus the other way around, which I think we've been historically led to believe.
Oh, there we go.
Oh, there we go.
And last but not least, these are the three questions I'm hoping that you can ask yourself, and that's, you know, who do I need to meet in their place? Where do I need to put my guard down? Where do I need to get rid of my comfort zone? And who do I need to approach? Where do I need to meet in their place, in their space, to understand differently and to understand uniquely? Where and how can I create space differently? Meaning, I'll give just a quick example here. I know and I've been guilty of this as a leader, going, you know what, I'm going to run a workshop meeting. I'm going to bring everyone from my team in. We're going to take a challenge and we're going to solve it within 30 to 60 minutes. That might not work for everyone on your team, right? Bring them in, give them a problem on the spot and say, we're going to solve it in 30, 60 minutes. Some of your most brilliant minds may need to actually take that away and go, you know what? I need to go be by myself. I can't be in a room with other people. I need to think about it overnight. I need some materials in advance, right? So as a leader, I would encourage you to think about, how are you creating space for not just individuals, but in how you're approaching things as a team to ultimately achieve the outcome you're looking for. That's not to say you can't get people in a room and try and brainstorm in the moment. It's just not everyone is necessarily going to be successful as part of that journey in the room, and you need to be aware of that. And last but not least, I think that's the most important question you could ask people in their one-to-ones. It's less about what can we do to include you, and it's more about how can I make you feel like you belong.
Perfect. Well, Curtis, thank you so much for meeting us in our space here and helping us
Hey, my pleasure.
understand things, hopefully a little bit better. I know I have learned a ton, and based on the comments and the questions that have come in, it is obvious the audience has as well. So thank you so much for joining us and sharing your experience. I greatly appreciate it. Jenny, any final comment?
No, that was excellent. Thank you, Curtis. It was phenomenal that you could be here this morning.
Oh, my
Absolutely.
absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And we are back in a couple of weeks, December 6th, to talk once again about performance and performance management and how to deal with poor performance. You know, Jenny, if we eventually get that one right, we'll just stop doing that session because everybody will have it figured out by then. But with that in mind, everybody have a fantastic weekend. Curtis, I appreciate your joining us this morning, and thank you so much for sharing. Jenny, as always, appreciate you. And have a great weekend, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good weekend.